Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and I want to talk about the movie John Krasinski's and Ryan Reynolds' 2024 film If, which stands for Imaginary Friend. And it's a film about imaginary friends. And I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons in context to this film, and I want to talk about intangible. That's a good, yeah, it's a really good. I want to talk about our ifs, right? Our intangible fighters, right? So we have player characters. This movie talks about imaginary friends, intangible identities that people have crafted that other people can't see and don't think are real, right? So this is a fascinating film, and I kind of want to talk about it and talk about it in context. And I want to talk about it, and I want to talk about it in context of Dungeons and Dragons. So let's jump in. So first of all, spoilers for all of the film, for all of John Krasinski's and Ryan Reynolds' um, film, If Imaginary Friends. So first of all, is this a good movie? No, it's a very bad movie. It's a movie that fails its execution. I think what it was attempting to do was an extremely noble thing, to explore intangible fighters, right? Imaginary friends. It was this concept to talk about entities that some people believe are real and some people do not believe are real, right? And so that's a noble thing. Like, of course, I think that's a noble thing because that's what we do in Dungeons and Dragons. We craft these intangible fighters, our own ifs, right? We craft these entities that the rest of the world does not think are real, but we think are quite real and can really impact the world and impact us and can impact others, right? And so I was very excited about this film, just from that perspective, because I'm very aware of having an intangible fighter, having an if, right? So this entity that is very real to me that others don't see and don't think matters or is there or is real, right? Like so, and I think we're all very used to that. Every dungeon master is used to this, right? We've had conversations with our NPCs. We've had conversations with our PCs, right? We interact with entities differently than the rest of the world. We really do, right? So this movie should be a great space for us. So I want to explain this movie, all right? And we're gonna have to go back to my childhood in the 1980s. So in 1980, I lived in Racine, Wisconsin. I was 10 years old, and I owned a brand new 1980 GT Pro Performer BMX bike. Had these gorgeous these yellow star. They were plastic. They were like a polycarbonate. They were rims, these starred rims. This bike was extremely light. It was an excellent BMX bike. And at this point in my life, I rode bicycles a lot. I've been riding since I was probably about 5. So I've been riding for about 5 years. And we lived in Racine, Wisconsin. And me and every other kid on the block rode BMX bikes all day, all summer, right? And it was a big deal. We did a lot, right? It was really a big thing. We loved BMX, right? So we would ride up and down our street. We would build these little ramps, these tiny little ramps. We'd jump over the ramps. And then there was this construction site that was about a mile and a half from our home. We would ride out there, ride all over the construction site whenever the workers weren't there, and we loved BMX, right? So this one, remember, about halfway through the summer, we got this idea in our head. There was a little ravine, there was a little creek, right, that ran around a couple of the houses, right, and the dirt on the one side. So basically, there was this long stretch of road, right, and the dirt on the one side kind of ramped up naturally, and we're like, oh my gosh, look at this. If we just packed some dirt here, we could make this natural incline about a foot higher, and then I think we could make this 10-foot jump. So all of us started talking about this, right? It took us about 2 weeks. We actually got a shovel, and and some of the parents were like, hey, what are you guys doing? And we're like, oh, just kind of kicking around, and so we built this ramp, this dirt ramp, right? And it took about a week, and everybody was like, hey, let's see if we could do it, right? So this kid, another kid, I can't even remember the guy who went first's name. I went second, and then one boy went third. And I remember that boy's name. His name was Rich. His first name was Richard, but we all called him Rich. And so basically, this first kid, he did it, and it was wild, right? So he did the jump, and he just sailed 10 feet over this thing, right? And we were all, and there's about 8 of us, right? All just lined up, right? And I did not have the courage to do it first. This other kid did it first, and he crushed it. He did a spectacular job, and he was able to, to get it done, right? He was able to fly over. So with his courage and the example that it could be done, I went second. Flew over that 10-foot gap on my, GT Pro Performer. And I had the nicest bike of all. My parents were very kind, and a lot of people really liked my bike. I was very fortunate. My parents were always extremely generous at Christmas. We were evangelical Christians, so that, that's our holiday. Like, we really, we go all out for it, right? And so they were extremely generous, and so I had a great bike. And actually, the kid who did it before me did not have a great bike, which means that his accomplishment was greater than mine. But I sailed over that 10-foot gap, right? And everybody was super charged and super hyped about it. And then Rich went, right? And he went over that gap, man, and he just came down sideways. Bike went out from and the bike bounced, right? And then he flew off the bike. The bike went in one direction, and he ended up, and he was hurt bad, right? He had scrapes all over, and we literally carried him and his bike back to his parents and just kind of ran, right? Next day, he literally broke his arm, right? It was bad. It was bad, right? And the reason why is his feet didn't stay on the pedals, right? That was the problem. That's if. If is the third person to go over the gap. This movie was talking about imaginary friends, intangible fighters, entities that are very real to some people and are not real to other people, right? And it did not, and so basically this movie horrifically failed as a film. Do not take any child to this film. It is deeply, deeply sad and upsetting, right? And the reason why is it talks about imaginary friends, and it's like, hey, imaginary friends, it's like, what happens to all these imaginary friends when people grow up and they just forget, and the kids just grow up and then they just forget these kids, right? What happens when kids grow up and they forget these creatures, right? And so the answer was that this little girl begins to do matchmaking, and she matches 2. She only does 2 in the whole film, right? Like, at the end, there's like a montage, which doesn't matter, because at that point you're like, oh, this movie's very bad, right? And the reality is, this movie failed because no one who had connected to this movie knew what an imaginary friend was, why some kids have imaginary friends and some don't, and what would actually reconnect an adult with an imaginary friend, and what an adult would do with an imaginary friend if they started to see an imaginary friend again after a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. So there were all these critical questions, these really important questions that really needed to be answered, by this film, and none of them were answered, and none of them, and the film was just deeply, deeply sad. Right? Probably one of the saddest films I've ever seen, and the reason why is it's just an astoundingly, it had Incredible questions and exactly zero answers. So, Rich went over that gap, right? And it was a disturbing event for all of us. But his attempt was needed and correct, right? It was an incredibly important attempt. So the If film, it's very good. And I don't know if I said don't see this. I thought this was a very bad film. You may want to see it, just like me, to see what somebody else's thoughts are about entities, right? Now, the real entities that some people think are very real and other people don't think are real, right? But the problem here is they understood there were valuable questions here, but they brought zero answers. Zero answers. I think they started with zero answers and they produced zero answers, right? And I think you should have been able to answer some of those questions before you even attempted to do this film, right? Like, I think it was very clear they had no idea why some kids create imaginary friends and some kids don't. And so right there, if you don't understand that core premise, you're not going to be able to say anything significant, right? But then it brings up so Rich went over that gap. It was a bold, brave attempt. That's the same thing here. The If was a bold, brave attempt, right? But it was, everybody who watches this is just going to walk away with homework, right? We had to carry Rich back to his parents and his bike back to his parents, and we had to run. And his parents came the next day asking questions, and all of us were like, I don't know, because there were no good answers, right? Like it was bad. It was a very bad situation. And I think that's what If is. It's a failed attempt at a noble. It's a failure at a noble attempt. That's the best way to say this, right? So I think that's really the best way to think about this film. Now let's talk about this from a D&D context, right? So we are very much here right now with Dungeons & Dragons. There is a massive division over what Dungeons & Dragons is and what it should be used for. If you read the Lego Dungeons & Dragons book, right in the instruction guide, it says increasingly there's conversations that Dungeons & Dragons can be of therapeutic benefit to many people. That's pretty astounding. Like, that doesn't sound like a game, right? Right? And then there's other people who are like, it's for chopping goblins in half, and it's just for wasting time while you drink beer and eat pretzels, right? And then there are other people who are like, Dungeons & Dragons is how you create television shows for Amazon, right? Different people have different ideas about what the purpose of Dungeons & Dragons is, right? To me, the heart of it is the intangible fighter. It is the entity that you believe is real, but nobody else does, right? So we have an if. If you're a dungeon master, if you're a dragon master, you have an if, right? Or more than one if. And then the second you start to understand that, I think there's an obligation. And that's what this film was saying. It was saying that once you create one of these entities, you have a responsibility to it. You can't forget it. And this is a conversation that is just starting with Dungeons & Dragons. What is our responsibility to our player characters? What is our responsibility to the characters that we create as dungeon masters? What is the responsibility to the characters that we create as dragon masters? What is the responsibility to dungeon master characters? What is the responsibility to dragon master characters? That's a really good question, right? And we are just now starting to answer it. The question is 50 years old, right? I don't think we fully have the answer yet, but that's what this channel is about. I'm trying to answer that question every day and explore this. And I want to say thank you for letting me explore it with you. Thank you very much for letting me share my opinion. Every single word you just heard is my humble opinion on intangible fighters, right? The important part is when I get to hear your humble opinion on entities that some people think are real and some people don't. I would love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.